Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm going to read primarily from some data that the task force with the National Association of Secretaries of State have prepared, and I'll inject some comments from my experience here in Louisiana. First off, I talk to you as that co-chairman. I share that with Denise Merrill out of Connecticut. I'm the newly elected Secretary of NAS and of course, Secretary of State of Louisiana. We, as the nation's chief elections officials, have been working hard to ensure that state laws and practices for emergency management of elections provide eligible voters with a positive voting experience and a process that is fair and equitable. Contingency planning and emergency responses are never a small task, especially in a decentralized system like we have in the United States, with an estimated 7,800 local jurisdictions, 200,000 polling sites, 2 million poll workers, and in the last cycle, approximately 125 to 130 million voters. The 2012 general election cycle will go down as a particularly memorable one for many of us. And we experienced a major curveball that none of us probably expected in the form of Hurricane Sandy that hit the East Coast just days before the November 6th presidential election, threatening to disrupt voting processes in at least 16 states. As the storm approached, we had an informal meeting that I conducted with several East Coast states, and then a formal one that was orchestrated by the Association of Secretaries of State, where we had a conference call with New York, Vermont, New Jersey, Maryland, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., Delaware, and Massachusetts. Having experienced storms like Katrina and Rita in the Louisiana and New Orleans area, the process in Louisiana is one that's well known. We go through this process, quite frankly, almost 2 or 3 times a year, and we have a very definitive process that we do. And that was what I attempted to communicate to my colleagues in those 16 states. There's various things you should do pre the storm approach to assess your issues, whether they be voting machines in harm's way and various other components. One of the things a lot of people forget, and we talked about commissioners in your earlier presentation, is your commissioners evacuate too. So you've got to have a method in order to contact them, know where they're going, and some contact reference point with them, amongst many, many other things. In January 2013, after the election was completed, the National Association of Secretaries of State formed a task force, of which as I indicated, I co-chair along with Secretary Merrill out of Connecticut, that consists of 24 states. The mission is to support state election officials in their efforts to efficiently adopt sound election practices in preparation for the response and to emergency conditions. Our goals are identifying relevant laws and policies related to disaster and emergency planning, sharing experiences and lessons learned from past emergency situations, engaging with relevant state and federal agencies and other stakeholders, and discussing ideas and strategies for effectively dealing with future emergency scenarios impacting an election. The task force has spent the last 6 months gathering research and compiling information that would be helpful to state election agencies. NAS conducted a survey of state election officials and officers to gain insights on laws governing emergency authority and election continuity, contingency planning, emergency outreach partnerships, and much more. I'm going to go over some of those highlights on those findings to date. The first area that NAS Task Force wanted to examine were laws and guidelines for the postponement of elections. In 2012, there was a lot of media buzz and public speculation around the idea that Hurricane Sandy would require postponement of the presidential election. Under the U.S. Constitution, the primary decision of postponing an election lies with the states. While federal law stipulates that emergency postponement power for federal elections must come from those with the power to make and alter such regulations of voting for Congress, Congress has never really exercised that authority according to the Congressional Research Service. Primary or local elections for federal office have only been postponed a handful of times since 1860, and they are very limited. But no examples could be found of a general election being postponed or delayed during a federal election cycle. For the most part, this matter has been left in the hands of the states. This makes great sense when it comes to disasters which tend to be localized and best evaluated by state and local officials on the ground when it comes to formulating a response. The NASS survey findings on the subject show that 12 of the 37 responding states have a law that specifically authorizes the suspension, delay, or postponement of an election in an emergency situation. In most of these states, a decision is to suspend or postpone an election is made by the governor of that state after a declared emergency by him or she. Chief election officials are a combination of the two. Most of the time, this action may only take place following a declaration of a state of emergency by the governor. In Louisiana, a state that I've already noted is no stranger to dealing with these types of aftermaths of hurricanes, the governor may suspend or delay an election upon declaring a state of emergency or an impending emergency, and upon certification by me or my office that an emergency exists, and the delayed election must resume or be rescheduled as soon as therefore practicable. Another important topic the NASS Task Force has sought to examine is the ways in which states can facilitate voting by individuals directly affected by emergencies, either because they are first responders who are helping with relief efforts in the area affected, or because the voters who have been displaced from their residence due to an emergency evacuation or some related factor such as injury. I want to note here that many states sent help to those eastern seaboard states, my state included, and that added an additional process. So it's emergency first responders not only in the affected states, but those that may leave to assist, energy workers, telephone, you go on and on and on. So you have to accommodate for that, and we made special allowances for them in Louisiana. While my state and states as California, Maine, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Virginia, and West Virginia have laws which clearly specify voting options for emergency workers and voters displaced by emergencies, a significant number of states are seeking to write laws in order to allow that for those effects. One of the chief highlights of the NASS survey may be the degree to which states told us that they could use their existing absentee voting, mail voting, and early voting procedures to facilitate voting by individuals in the aforementioned circumstances. For example, the Washington Secretary of State's office noted that the state's mailing ballot system, which includes the ability to electronically download a replacement ballot, inherently provides increased access to those affected by an emergency. Now, I want to note here that sounds good on paper and policy, but if you don't have any electricity, that can be a problem. So you have to be prepared for that. And I will give you one quick example. Have a great relationship with your National Guard. Your National Guard has tents, generators, and other facilities. Make sure you have a good relationship with your energy company. Make sure if you're going to change voting precinct locations that there may be nearby a hospital that will get energy first, or other facilities of that type. So you have to think forward on those issues and do not assume you will have electricity. Even something as simple as lack of cell phone service. You know, if you can't get your phone recharged, you have no more phone service. So you have to go to almost a military model with the National Guard or your Sheriff's Department and the like. So the motto here is be prepared for the absolute worst. And we all are used to living in a nice air-conditioning building like this, but with inability to even open up windows, you can see what the problem is when it gets a little warm, or in the case of Sandy, when it got freezing cold. In the wake of Sandy, which interrupted early voting and damaged or destroyed polling places in several states, officials were able to mitigate the storm's impacts on voters through a variety of actions. Consider the following. In New York and New Jersey, more than 250 polling places were relocated, while displaced voters were permitted to vote provisional ballots in any polling place in the state. Connecticut extended its voting registration deadline by 2 days. Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania extended their deadlines for requesting absentee ballots, while the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia extended their deadlines for early voting and absentee voting. Maryland allowed displaced voters to receive absentee ballots by email or fax, and New Jersey designated displaced voters as overseas voters, which allowed them to return their ballot by email. One other quick example, we experienced, even in Louisiana, for those of you who do not remember, the overseas military ballots. There was a plane in Afghanistan that burnt on the ground, though primarily all those ballots would have gone to New York City, affected by Sandy. We were able, through the new process, to backtrack all those individuals from Louisiana whose ballots were on that plane, alert them, have them revote, and I extended on the emergency authority 2 days for the receipt of that. So just an example that occurred that you could have never anticipated. The final piece of the puzzle is contingency planning and state emergency preparedness procedures. These efforts have long been an important part of the election administration. There are many scenarios that warrant taking precautions and making preparations to prevent, negate, and recover from an emergency situation that may disrupt an election. A number of states have well-established guidelines for reporting and making recommendations with respect to regional, state, and local contingency planning efforts. 10 of the 37 states responding to the NAS survey said they have statutory requirement for the development of an emergency election contingency plan. However, the vast majority of responding states have proactively developed materials to facilitate the administration of the elections in emergency situations. Some more specific examples include communication plans. I see my time is up, for emergency situations, including contract information for key staff, procedures for informing voters of the news media, contingency paper ballots for touchscreen technology, power outage procedures for polling places, including evaluation of polling place power needs, polling place relocation, and on and on. I would urge you to go to the NAS Task Force has this ongoing process on their website, and I also would urge you to go to the FEMA site. It gives you some very good suggestions. I will conclude with that. I shortened it a little bit in the effort of time, but it is, I think this copy of my presentation is in your hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Shedler. Director Valentine.
Good morning. My name is Todd Valentine. I'm one of the co-executive directors of the New York State Board of Elections, and I've been with the State Board since 1997 and the co-executive director since 2008. And I currently serve as the treasurer of the National Association of State Election Directors. And this panel has been asked here to speak about disaster preparedness. And, unfortunately, when we talk about disasters, New York State has had its share of disasters that have impacted the election process. The most recent was Hurricane Sandy, but before that was the flooding from Irene that had devastated sections of upstate New York, and before that, of course, was September 11th, was on the day of our primary election. Now, one of the critical things we've learned is that a key role for those outside of the disaster area is to help establish lines of communication between the election officials themselves and whoever else they need to talk with. Police and fire departments, power companies, highway departments, etc., all depending on what hurdle they are facing at the moment. And of course, you have to work out to the poll workers and of course the voters at some point. But we're not the first responders, and I don't even think we're the second responders. The process that we outside the area are there to help put Humpty Dumpty back together again. We're there to help to connect to people, to put the pieces together and run the election. We want to bridge the gap that they talk to each other is a critical function. Now, at the end of the day, what I want to emphasize is that elections are about people, both those running the election and those voting. Providing a human contact, even if just by phone, and reminding them that there are people to help and support them, it helps to tell them that they'll get through it. There's a lot of psychological support that goes into this. People you're speaking to, have been through a traumatic event, and you have to remember that, and that you're asking them to push forward and hold an election. As the Secretary pointed out, there's been very few incidents in the history of this country where elections have been delayed. They're just not canceled. We run the election. And sometimes it takes a little bit of tough love. When we had the flooding from Irene, one of our counties gets on the phone and asks, hey, when are we going to postpone the election to? And the storm had hit about a week before the election, and our answer was very clear and unequivocal. You're holding this election on the original date. And then they said they needed to think about that. They get off the phone. A few minutes later, they get on the phone with the county sheriff and calls and starts down the same postponement path. And we said, we can't postpone the election. Now, this is a bit of an overstatement, but we said in over 200 years, we've only had one election postponed, and that was 9/11, and that was on the day of the election. So the sheriff comes back a few minutes later and says, then we're all on the phone. Now, what can we do to help you? So great. From then on, we worked together. They need, to help get to what they needed, and the election went on. I'm not saying it was perfect, but it went on. Again, the lesson I took away from that, and that I think you need to remember here is, we can talk about plans and contact lists, but you're still talking with people in crisis. They've had their lives disrupted, property destroyed, and sadly, in the worst cases, there's been injuries or loss of loved ones. And, you don't want to underestimate the state of shock that they can be in. And, a lot of times when you're in these areas, you can just, if it's in a disaster, you can just delay what you're doing. The business can close for a little bit. You can fix the damage, and then you can repair it. But the importance of holding that regularly scheduled election is just one of those bedrock principles that everybody rallies around to into a crisis. When we're going to hold that election, and we do. And, even after 9/11, it was only a matter of a few weeks. We rescheduled the election and held the general election on time. I agree with the secretary that, the contact list and that initial contact is the hard part, but it's the important part. As I said, the first thing, they're not thinking about elections. And what we've learned to do, and this is certainly what we did this fall, was we don't wait for you to call them. Try to get ahead of the curve if you can. And that's easy when you can see the storm coming. It's a little bit easier, or the flood, but sometimes you can't. But immediately afterwards, don't wait. Reach out to them, because if you wait for them to call you, it may be a problem. And that's why having a variety of contact lists. And, what we found is that people can always seem to get to a telephone. The cell phone network, the internet's down, the fax machine's flooded, but the cell network generally holds up, again, as long as you have battery life on your phone. But it was surprising the number of people who would go out, charge their phone up in the car, and then come back or call us from that. But what we would do, we found one of the key things we would do is we would just set up a virtual place to talk, a series of phone calls. We would provide the 800 number with a conference line. They could dial into us. It gave them one number to call, and then we would bring the people to that line. And that's, you start with a lot, and it seems like a lot when you're talking to somebody every few hours, morning, noon, at the end of the day. But you need to assess the situation early on to figure out what it is you're missing. What do you need to get through the crisis? For example, in Sandy, one of the issues we had was talking with the power companies. And, there are a number of power companies that service New York City and the surrounding metro area. But they didn't always talk to the boards of elections. So it was important for us to bring them to the phone so that they could understand, that polling places need power at some point in time, and what is their schedule for storing these. And it was also critical to get the boards of elections to understand on the other side that there are some other priorities the power company has, like the hospitals and healthcare facilities, and that the polling place may not be first on the list. But knowing when it was going to be restored allowed, and whatever that schedule was, allowed the boards to work out contingency plans for either moving the poll sites to where there was power or bringing auxiliary power if necessary. And of course, during Irene, before that, what we did there was, it wasn't so much a loss of power, but it was a loss of, a lot of roads had been washed out. So you had access to the polling sites. We had to help coordinate an additional transportation or a shuttle network for people who just couldn't get around because a lot of the roads were in very rough conditions. So, getting buses to move people around to the polling sites was something we helped them get through. And, after 9/11 was, you stop the election. It wasn't an easy thing to do, but what's not built into our statute, and, this is just one of those things that we've never, it's hard to address beforehand, is, there are emergency provisions for stopping an election. Our governor clearly has those authorities, and almost all governors would. And the report that NAS puts out demonstrates or shows good examples of where those legislative issues are. But our statute doesn't allow, there's no provision automatically for postponing an election. And even a primary election, there's a provision which allows for an additional day of voting or extending the or having an additional hours of the election on some additional day, but it still says you have to have the election first and show that enough people didn't show up to be eligible to get the additional day of voting. 9/11 was a little bit different because we used the emergency power, stopped the election, but then our role as the Board of Elections was to help bring the legislature back together because this had never happened before. We had to legislate a whole new calendar for the election in the truncated time period because there was no way to move the general election. So we had to figure all that out. But that was our role, was to provide that communication connection with the county boards of elections so they knew those that weren't directly impacted by the disaster, but okay, when are we going to run the election again? You know, and it would be great to have a whole fleet of backup election machines and staff that could just swoop in. Okay, you guys can rest, deal with your crisis, and we'll take over the job. But there just simply aren't enough people or machines. And, you know, I'll give you an example. In New York State, we have over 15,000 polling places that are staffed by over 60,000 poll workers on a statewide election. And so what we try to do is to get people in these situations to think of not what they need, but what can you do without, and then work to provide the minimum. It's not going to be the best situation, you know, and we're the facilitators to be there supportive in running the election that's been disrupted. And, you know, at the end of the day, we just need to find a way to make this work.
Thank you very much. Director Giles.
Good morning. I want to thank the Commission for inviting me here today to share my experiences and perspectives on conducting elections in the wake of a natural disaster. Today, I would like to speak about, once you put the pieces together to conduct the election, how to get that information out to the voters. I'm going to give a timeline of some of the actions taken by the state of New Jersey as a result of Superstorm Sandy. Then I will discuss some of the lessons learned that may be helpful to this commission. Monday, October 29th, the storm made landfall about 8 p.m. and pounded the state throughout the night. For the next several days, the state was involved in assessing the damage and preparing for the election. During this time, the state and counties were inundated with phone calls and emails from voters asking for assistance in finding out how and where to vote. There were numerous people who said to us, "I have lost my home and everything I own. Please don't let me lose my right to vote." This really resonated with the election officials. It was so important to these individuals that while their entire lives were in chaos, it seemed the one thing they could count on that gave them some sense of normalcy was their right to vote. So the state started releasing a series of directives, and I'm only going to discuss the directives or components of those directives that directly relate to informing voters on how or where to vote. So on Thursday, November 1st, the state directed that individuals designated by the state or county election offices could assist in delivering and returning an unlimited number of mail-in ballots to voters who were displaced and living in shelters. The existing law only allowed an individual to assist with the delivery of a maximum of 10 mail-in ballots. The county election officials utilized this opportunity because they knew many of the people staying in the shelters were not going to be able to get to their polling places on November 6th, so they brought the voting to them. Friday, November 2nd. At this point, 900 of New Jersey's 3,500 polling places were still not available, either due to loss of power or damage. It became very apparent that the counties were going to be finding and moving polling places right up to the last minute. The state was facing the dilemma of how to notify voters where their polling places would be on November 6th. There wasn't going to be enough time to mail anything to the voters. Even if there was enough time, there was limited postal service in certain areas, and so many voters were displaced that we wouldn't have been able to get mail to them anyway. Fortunately for New Jersey, we began participating in the Voting Information Project over the summer, which is sponsored by the Pew Charitable Trust. And basically, the way this works is the state gives the Voting Information Project team information about where and how to vote in their state. The Voting Information Project, partnering with Google, created a free application programming interface and API that gives websites and mobile devices the ability to grab the state's information and share it with their users. New Jersey focused on a texting tool put out by Mobile Commons that would have the voters text the word where or donde to 877-877, and then they would receive a text back asking for their address, and based on that information, they would receive information about their polling place location. We began promoting this with the media as a way voters could find out where their polling places were going to be. We stressed that voters use this tool on Election Day, so if there were any changes to their polling place at the last minute, they would be able to access the most up-to-date information. We were promoting basically a know before you go approach. Saturday, November 3rd. In addition to the state working with the media, the counties were directed to provide notification to voters about changes to polling place locations by using county websites, reverse 911, public service announcements, newspaper notices, and posting notices at all unavailable polling places, informing voters of the new location provided it was safe to do so. Realizing not everyone was going to be able to receive this information or be able to return to their designated polling place, the state issued a directive allowing displaced voters to vote a provisional ballot at any polling place in the state. So basically, if an eligible voter saw a vote here sign, they could walk in and vote a provisional ballot anywhere in the state. Sunday, November 4th. The state began a series of conference calls with advocates and interested parties to ensure they were informed of the state's plan and that everyone was on the same page. This was an important partnership in assisting the state in getting the correct information out to the voters. It was another set of resources the state was able to utilize in its effort to communicate with the voters, not only prior to but on Election Day. This group included the ACLU, the League of Women Voters, Disability Rights New Jersey, and the Lowenstein Center for Public Interest. Monday, November 5th. By the end of the day, all polling places were established. The counties were able to do this through the use of generators and/or moving and consolidating polling places where necessary. The statewide voter registration system was updated, and a final file was sent to the Voting Information Project team for use with the websites, mobile apps, and the texting tool. Tuesday, November 6th, Election Day. According to the United States Election Project, New Jersey had a turnout of the voting eligible population of 62.6%, as compared to the national average of 58.7%. And according to a study conducted by Charles Stewart of MIT, New Jersey had the 9th shortest wait time to vote in the country, which averaged between 5 and 10 minutes. The reason I bring these statistics up is, well, honestly, because it gives me the opportunity to brag about my county and local election officials. Because without them, none of this would have been possible. And I also have to give credit to our citizens for their resolve in exercising their right to vote. And it makes a great segue into some of the lessons that we learned. Tip O'Neill said all politics is local, but in our world, it's elections that are local. And Sandy really proved that to us, that without a good team at the local level, it's very difficult to conduct an election. So it's important to remember what gets decided at the federal and state level eventually has to trickle down to the local level to be implemented. So as this commission makes its recommendations, it's important to remember that at some point it's going to have to be implemented at the local level. Another lesson learned is that the media can be a very powerful tool, but making sure your message is the one the voter is hearing can sometimes be a challenge based on your geography. In New Jersey, the northern part of the state gets most of their news from the New York media, and the southern part of the state gets most of its news from the Philadelphia media. This can lead to voter confusion if not all the states are doing the same thing. And earlier I spoke about the Voting Information Project and how valuable it was for New Jersey. I just want to give you a few statistics on how much it was actually used in New Jersey and across the country during the 2012 general election cycle to show what a valuable tool social media can be. Nationally, there were more than 25 million lookups via the Google and Microsoft tools combined. The tool is embedded in over 600 websites like CNN, ABC, Fox News, Rock the Vote, and Facebook. In New Jersey, we focused on promoting the texting tool since many voters were without power and there was no need for a smartphone to send a text. As a result, there were 138,710 texts in New Jersey. In comparison, New York used the tool to a lesser degree and had 58,500 texts, and then there were 46,211 texts for the rest of the country. This meant New Jersey accounted for 57% of all the texts used on this tool. And these tools are not only valuable during disasters, but can also be used to address some of the issues facing the Commission, like long lines. Tools like this can be used to not only tell you where to vote, but how long the wait is. For example, if a county uses vote centers and there's a 1-hour wait at one vote center, a voter could find another vote center that may only have a 10-minute wait. I'm out of time, so I will wrap it up with that. And again, I want to thank you for having me here today and allowing me to share my experiences.
Thank you very much. Professor Stein.
Thank you. I have a lot, and it's in my written report, so I'll go through this rather quickly, and I hope I don't mess this up. Basically, what I'm looking at are two questions. What steps do local officials take when they prepare for and respond to natural disasters, and do they work? And I'm really delighted I got to be on this panel. I don't know if Nate was smart enough or got all the airline tickets wherever. But what's really encouraging is that I had seen all this data, but I didn't have a chance to talk to a lot of these election officials. And I kept asking Nate, like, who are they? And he's, well, I don't know yet. I'll tell you when you get there. So this is really kind of, I hope this doesn't disappoint anyone. What I looked at was, of course, Hurricane Sandy. It made landfall on the 29th. My definition of a county that was affected was the FEMA Declaration of Disaster. I actually am collecting and have collected, and at a later date I'll give the Commission more of the data about the actual dollar loss and power loss. But I'm looking at 225 counties, 24 states, and it was a pretty severe, as we just heard, hurricane and disrupted the election. So what did we look at and what might we expect to happen? Depressed voter turnout, an increase in the proportion of voters who ballot by mail or in person where it's available, an increase in the proportion of voters who cast a provisional ballot. And all of this you heard from the other election officials. What I was looking at also is like, so what can you do? I was particularly interested, and I didn't know the history of cancellation of elections, and it just doesn't happen. Rarely does it happen, and only under the most catastrophic and tragic circumstances. Convenience voting seems to be what I've used the term convenience voting, in-person early voting, no excuse mail-in voting, and election day vote centers as a way to address this problem, if at least you can know that there's a hurricane coming or there might be a potential disruption. The others are looking at provisional voting or relaxed provisional voting, and the other, of course, the one that I put a lot of focus on and I'll talk a great deal about, is how you operate your local election polling places. Remember that all of these other ones that are on that list have to be delegated by the state. And in a partisan environment that we're in, it's just simply not practical to assume that the states that don't have no excuse early mail-in voting or in-person early voting are going to adopt them, not anytime soon. So I thought Bob Giles' comment was particularly important. Look at what you can do and what you probably can do in terms of polling place operations. What I looked at here was two concepts, openness and centralization. Openness simply means that a voter can vote at any location throughout the county rather than the restricted location. And if it's in-person early voting, they can vote on a number of days. We know this to be an effective vehicle for not only increasing possibly turnout, but it reduces lines. And in fact, if you look at Charles's data, which I've done and reanalyze it, there's some disparities between long lines, only it's the early voting places that actually have longer waiting times, and people like it. So be careful what you wish for. You may think long lines are bad, but in states like Nevada, Colorado, Texas, long lines may not necessarily be the big problem. Early voting is where you get to choose and where and when you get to vote. Second was centralization, which I put a big deal of emphasis on. It's the idea that instead of having a large number of relatively small voting places, you have a small number of larger places. And this hurricane gave us a natural experiment to study that, as we just heard in New Jersey. what I looked at here was the 2008-2012 presidential election. I took the EAC's Administration and Voting Survey, about 3,000 counties. I compared before and after in counties that were under a disaster declaration, not just in, of course, those areas, but throughout the country. My measures here were vote cast as a percent of total registered voters, the percent of total vote cast by absentee, in-person early, provisionally. I looked at voting place practices, particularly number of voting places per vote cast and poll workers per vote place. These tables are kind of small, but we'll get to the quick, and I'm watching my clock. Yeah, the hurricane reduced turnout. And it did so significantly, and it did so in a manner that is robust. By that I mean, even when you control for things that we know obviously turn out voters, such as competitive races, good weather, which was obviously not the case here, we still have a difference of between about, on average in these counties, 2.8% fewer voters turned out in 2012 in counties that had a disaster declaration than in all other counties in the U.S. And that is a persistent finding. What's interesting here also is that, in fact, the proportion of vote cast early, whether it was in person or by mail, actually went up just a little bit. And why didn't it go up more, and why couldn't it have gone up more? For the obvious reason here, and I'm going to get to this table in a minute, is that most states that were affected by the hurricane do not have flexible voting. Only 3 states of the 10 that had a disaster, 1 or more counties with a disaster declaration, allow no excuse mail-in voting, and only 1 state, Maryland, has in-person early voting, and it adopted it, conveniently for me, in 2012. So we actually get a nice before and after. And yes, there was an increase in in-person early voting, almost all, if not exclusively, driven by Maryland. I won't go through some of this other data other than to simply say it doesn't take rocket science to figure out what Bob just told us. When you have a hurricane, you consolidate voting places. So in counties that were under a disaster delegation, the number of voters per polling place went up, and went up significantly, by about 100 per polling place. And not surprisingly, the number of poll workers per polling place went up. So what we had was what you would call a consolidation or centralization. Question, did that make a difference? Now, I don't know, as Bob pointed out, the New Jersey or New York election officials did this intentionally. To a large extent, it was forced on them by the areas that did have power, the areas that were accessible. But the bottom line basically was you had a natural kind of experiment here, and I use that with a qualified. You got to see what would happen if you just had to consolidate to a small number of very large polling places. And the question was, did that make a difference? And you bet, it made a huge difference. That's the distribution and change of voter turnout. It's nice normal. I did a rather extensive statistical analysis. It's a reasonably robust analysis. What's the bottom line in the finding? This is the effect of increasing the size of a polling place. So on the horizontal axis is the number of voters per polling place. On the vertical axis is turnout. What you have are disaster counties, non-disaster counties. The interesting question is, if you consolidate, you go to a smaller number of larger polling places, and that would be on the far left side of the horizontal axis, do you get higher turnout? And the answer is no. In disaster counties, yes. In non-disaster counties, the effect is marginal. Or a small number of very large polling places actually helped keep the turnout higher. Why? Because you get more efficient operations. This is what you get in vote centers in Texas, Colorado. You're consolidating the number of poll workers to a large box place where it's accessible for parking. It's not built for 5-year-olds. You have not 5 or 6 polling machines, but 20. And here's the interesting one. If you've been in a hurricane and you've lost your identification, you can't get to your polling place, there's somebody to tell you what to do. There's somebody there to tell you that this is how you use a voting machine, because the last time you used it was 4 years ago. Most voters vote once every 4 years. I think the thing that counties can do that effectively addresses not just emergencies, and I think you've heard it from these election officials, but for any general election, is to look at the way in which you disperse your scarce resources. Retailers do it, Walmart does it, McDonald's does it. I don't know why it would be a bad thing to do for our own elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll begin the questioning with Commissioner Grayson.
I know that a lot of jurisdictions, at least on paper, have contingency plans, emergency plans that they hopefully, when something like this happens, you break the glass. In Louisiana, you probably don't have glass that you break. You use it all the time. I guess I'm curious, there were a lot of great work to pull off the elections this year, and I'm curious, how effective were those plans, if they existed, in your respective states? And what were the areas where they were found they didn't have the right steps or recommendations or that sort of thing? And how did you find that because I do think this is an area where there is some planning that takes place. I know there was a big push after the 2004 election to do this. And just curious how those plans in action turned out to, how effective they turned out to be.
Well, I'll start off. In Louisiana, we found them to be very effective, simply, I guess, because of the frequency and how long we've been dealing with this. As we've seen over the last few years, it seems like these storms are starting to hit the East Coast, and I'm sure that, the more it's kind of a crazy deal, but the more disasters you have, your learning curve diminishes. So we, quite frankly, have our process down pretty effectively, and it works for us, and it's just a routine deal for us. I mean, we may have, this year we haven't had any threats, but some years we have 5 or 6 where we have to move our machines out of harm's way and assess our voting precinct locations. They're the same ones we've been moving for years. Some, because of the frequency of that, we've actually changed permanently, but each event, you get a little bit better at it. So for us, it works.
Is there an area where where you saw that improvement, where there was the shortcoming? I guess so in addition to, if they didn't perform well, were there specific areas where you saw that you had to improve it, that the plan didn't contemplate or
No,
contemplate
I can't honestly say that. I mean, the only change has been just a change in dynamics of elections to a certain degree. I mean, it's an instant gratification society we live in now, so, but I find people almost more tolerant. I think New Jersey and New York emphasize that. Individuals under stress like this, it's amazing, and their house would be flooded and they'd show up to be a commissioner. People just seem to be a little bit more tolerant in those kind of situations than on a bright sunny day when they want to go to a football game or go hunting. If they experience a long line on that day, they have something to say if it's an emergency and everybody's in the same boat, they just seem to be a lot more patient. So that's been our experience.
Yeah, I mean, there's always plans. They look good on paper. The one thing that has been effective as far as planning was, with the equipment and the hardware. I mean, it's regularly tested to make sure if power does go out, what to do. All the counties, you have to constantly update contact chains. And the one thing we've always emphasized is, because elections are clearly run locally and disasters are responded to locally, is that connection always has to be there with the highway department, with the police department, the fire department, the sheriff's department. And, that's been effective is that. The one thing that's, it's not ineffective, it's just we don't know what's going to happen. So, the best laid plans, I'm not going to say or get set aside, but the best plan is the one that conforms to the crisis that's there. So that's why, the communication networks start with talking, figure out what you need, and then broaden from there. Because, it's not like with a power company that has a clear contingency plan to bring in outside workers. Like, there's no way to just start shifting election workers around, because the same workers that are outside the disaster have to run the election there too. So as I said, there's no way to just move in replacement machinery. It's just, what's wrong, and let's see what we can bandage together. So as far as plans, they're effective until the next disaster and you figure out what the problem is. But, it's there. At least everybody's, as the Secretary said, they understand the need to respond to it, and I think that's where the plan, the consciousness of knowing that you're going to be in a crisis has been effective.
I agree with what Todd was saying. And I think some of it depends on the level of the disaster. I mean, in New Jersey, our plans go back to after 9/11 and more based on what if there was a terrorist attack, so a lot of plans were developed out of that, I believe. And those were more geared to a county level, that if there's an issue, because you don't think of a statewide disaster like Sandy that we went through. So I think part of that is one, now when you're looking at a disaster of that size, where do you fall as an election or election officials in the priority? Hospitals, water treatment, these things, basic life functions have to be taken care of first. And then you have to know where you are in that pecking order. And I think that's one of the lessons we learned, that we got the information to the power companies, but we knew our polling places were not the top priority. They had to get certain things up and running. So, that kind of communication, and I think the communication with, your emergency management teams and FEMA of what you can and can't do, what you can and can't spend, those are the type of things that I think need to be built into the plans. So going in, if we have to buy generators, where are we going to buy them? What size generators do we need? That was a huge lesson we learned. We just walked in and said, hey, we need generators. Or, well, what size? Mm-hmm. You need a 5,000 watt or a 10,000 watt? So you had to lay out the polling place. And so these are the kind of things, like Todd said, until you and Secretary Sedler, until you live through it and actually get in the weeds of it, your plan is great on paper until you really do that. So I think that's kind of where we are walking away from Sandy, saying, all right, we need to maybe get in the weeds a little bit more and know what we can get from emergency management, know what we really need to do. So a very broad plan, make sure you have good contact numbers, where everybody's going to go, is great for a small level disaster, but when it gets to that scale, it really changes the game.
Have you had a chance to actually revise the plans since then, or is that just, I know it's an ongoing process, but I didn't know because it'd be interesting for us maybe to look at a before and after to see things like the generator size, that you probably got more specific on there than you.
Correct, and we're in the process. It's a work in process,
Yeah.
and I know NASA's putting together the white paper, and Secretary wants to talk about that a little more, but I think definitely when you live through it, you realize that a pretty generic plan is not going to be good enough.
Yeah.
One thing that I'd actually like to hear a comment on is, my other research area is hurricanes. I do a lot of work on evacuations. I think that's I'm probably the only political scientist that studies elections and hurricanes. One of the databases I've gotten, I didn't have time to analyze it until before I wrote the report, was the states have emergency planners have a ranking for power restoration. So I asked a simple question. Are the power rankings for restoration correlated with where we vote? I took New Jersey's because I wanted to see what places did New Jersey use for Election Day operations and what areas were high priority for restoration. One of the rankings is schools, but not elementary and not small schools, big box schools like high schools, community centers, stadia, activity centers, and that's where they were holding their elections. So
because of shelter, they used
the shelters.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the Secretary remembers that when Louisiana voters were evacuated to Houston during Hurricane Katrina, they actually held early voting in Houston.
In the Estradome, right?
And Beverly Kaufman ran it at big box locations, 5 of them on the southwest side where they were heavily concentrated in temporary housing under Bill White. And again, very efficient voting. So I think to some extent there's some natural opportunities here for overlap.
Thanks.
Commissioner
So to
McKeon.
follow up on that, with the power company issue, we gave them our list of polling places prior to the storm hitting. And one of the things we found was they worked really well with us, is these weren't transformers and these were entire grids down. So they would get a grid up and running and let us know, okay, this list of polling places should now have power. but only when the grid started up again did you find the transformers out. And again, we got back to the issue of about how important your locals are to then get you that information to say, okay, this school, even though the grid's back up, is still down. So that constant communication with the power company is critical leading up to the election.
Commissioner McGeehan. Oh, sorry, Secretary. Secretary Shedler, did you have a comment?
Well, I just wanted to add that I think that's the good thing about this task force with NAS is that we are now starting to correlate, and just like we share information on all election issues and the like at our conferences, we're now, hopefully, at this process will be a moving target. As we learn more, we're going to continue to put more down on the white paper and the plans. And as was someone asked about the plans, I mean, they're constantly changing. I mean, I could establish plans now based on 30 hurricanes, and a hurricane comes in from a different angle, and all of my polling places I've got to change. So it is a difficult process, and you just got to have basically a shell of what you need to do and a pecking order. But I could go back historically on 30, and the 31st one may be completely different. It destroys all those well-laid plans. But the basics, the building blocks, the ABCs of blocking and tackling remain the same. Assess your situation before and after, close contact with your National Guard and energy companies, close contact with you. Those are basics that are uniform no matter what the scenario may be.
Commissioner McGeehan.
Yes, I had a question for Professor Stein. It's a little bit tangential to preparing for natural disasters, but I was curious. I thought I heard you say that convenience voting, that you've done some studies where you've seen maybe there's a slight increase in turnout. Generally, what we've heard, I think on a lot of the commission hearings, have been that voters enjoy convenience voting. It makes it easier, but that it doesn't necessarily have a positive impact on voting. And I was curious, do you have information that...
Yeah, that's correct. The historical record is that convenience voting, in-person early voting, does not have a dramatic, has marginal effects, if any at all. However, and Charles is sitting in the back, there's a paper forthcoming by Barry Burden and his colleagues at the University of Wisconsin that detected a peculiar finding, and that is that early voting matched with same-day registration has a significant impact on turnout. And there's some other work by Jan Legley that shows that early voting when matched with party activities, mobilization activities, and the two chairmen of the commission know something about these campaigns, when the parties target voters in their parties, their partisans, for early voting, whether it's mail-in or in-person, yes. So by itself, no. But when it's used in conjunction with either same-day registration, which is not ubiquitous by any means, it does. But generally, no. And I think your second comment, which is absolutely correct, which is that the level of support for these types of convenience voting is quite high, whether it's mail-in, in-person.
Commissioner Patrick.
Just to follow up on that real quickly, and then I have one other question, is that we've also seen that that's when you're only looking at federal elections, but that convenience voting can have a dramatic impact on turnout in local races and that sort of thing as well. And I'm not sure if you would agree with that or not.
You guys read the literature really well. In-person early voting has not historically, Adam Berinsky, prof at MIT, has done a pretty good review of literature, but if you look at election day vote centers, as practiced in Colorado, Texas, soon to come in some other states like Indiana, it's had a significant effect and non-trivial effect, 5 to 8 points on turnout. So it depends on what you mean by convenience voting. If voters on election day, who are not what we call the hardiest of voters, they're not people who have... An early voter is probably somebody who's voted with some regularity. So giving them or her that opportunity to vote early is just convenience. But when you provide the same kind of convenience on election day, the vote centers, they do have a dramatic effect on voter turnout. What's most interesting, it has no effect whatsoever on partisan voter turnout. So if you said, oh, sure, it'll increase voter turnout, vote centers, and it does, and it increases it dramatically among people who don't have a history of voting, that must always lead to a Democratic higher turnout. Absolutely not. And what people forget is that Republican voters are dying and not being replaced at a higher rate. So in states like Colorado, where they gave us a natural experiment because only half the counties adopted it, we could see exactly what was happening. You got habitual non-voters who were getting caught in voting simply because it was much more convenient along Highway 35 at vote centers that were hotels and convenience stores. So you got to be careful about what you're talking when you're using about in-person early voting and mail-in voting. That requires a lot of knowledge and information that voters are only going to get imparted to them by partisan candidates who want them to vote. But these election day voters, they are people who are as undecided about voting as to when they're going to vote. And the vote centers in Colorado, now New Mexico, Albuquerque, Austin, Texas has just adopted it. And don't forget Lubbock, my favorite. Ann remembers that, the first. And they did use Twitter and text messaging to tell people the lines. It's had a dramatic effect on turnout. So it depends on what you're talking about when you talk about convenience.
And I was referring mostly to early voting by mail in the Western definition of early voting. So my other question has to do with the task force and the recommendations, and what do you foresee coming out of this? And what I'm thinking about in terms of what you said about the media outlets. And when something like Sandy impacts a multi-state region where the states are all potentially doing something either dramatically different or slightly different, is the notion that the task force will have these recommendations, these best practices, this white paper, that hopefully, potentially, the individual states may adopt some of these recommendations so that there will be some more uniformity in those regions when they are impacted so that there won't be as much voter confusion? Is that, is media interface part of the task force and how to try and mitigate some of the confusion by voters? Now, the other thing is people have said, I'm sorry, if you live in a certain part of the state and you know you're getting your information from another state, the voters should understand. But again, these are people in traumatic situations. So I'm just curious if that's being addressed in any way in the task force paper.
Yes, ma'am, it is. It's a very good question, and it leads me to one thing that I wanted to mention in my comments. FEMA. I would recommend to anyone, if you have a disaster, to get yourself a specific disaster relief appropriation, because it bypasses a lot of the regulatory processes that FEMA has to go by. We felt that effect of the election post-Katrina, the New Orleans election. We spent some $3.5 million over and above extraordinary expenses to put on that election. When you talk about putting on issues in Houston, Texas, and Atlanta, Georgia, and Birmingham, Alabama, and Memphis, Tennessee for a citywide election, obviously you have cost. You have personnel cost, you have hotel cost. We were disallowed all those costs. We didn't have the ability to go to a sign company to make nice, pretty signs for us, so we had to get 4x8 pieces of plywood, and everybody got a paintbrush out, and we painted them white, and we put where the new precinct locations are. We got no reimbursement for that. We got no reimbursement for postage to outreach and some of our media expense. And that was because we did not have a direct appropriation from Congress to pay it that would have bypassed a lot of the bureaucratic red tape at FEMA. So one of the things I think you could do would be to maybe standardize that, because I told my colleagues many times, I don't care if you have to get somebody to write down the approval for what they're telling you can do on a paper napkin. It's better than just talking, because 4 years later, when you're trying to argue with FEMA on your second and third appeal, and you have nothing in writing, but it made logical sense at the time, and you know Susie or Joe told you to do it, you better have something in writing. So it was a learning process for us, and I promise you we'll never do it again that way. New York, I think, had that direct appropriation after 9/11, and that's the way to go. But that's one good example. Regarding media, that's a tough one, quite frankly. I mean, we were fortunate. We had WWL 870, which is it's a huge wattage station that gets into Atlanta, Chicago on clear nights. That was our dominant source. But it was indicated with New Jersey and northern New Jersey getting their media out of New York, and it may be a different process. I mean, some of those areas it makes some sense to unify something in a disaster across state lines, but it's a difficult one. But we have cataloged all of the laws across our states, And, you can't force somebody to do it, but obviously best practices would indicate to at least take a look at that. And we'll have that report finished February 14. And obviously it'll be an ongoing project, but our first formal report be put out on February 14.
We have about 7 minutes left in this panel. I have questions here from Commissioner Mays and Mr. Britton, and I'm going to allow you, Commissioner Ginsburg, if you'd like to question Mr. Stein closely on his comments about the lifespan of Republican voters. I'm sure we'll be glad to extend for a few minutes. I listen closely.
It's very kind of you to make
Yes, yes. Otherwise known as reverse turnout.
Democratic style.
Commissioner Mays.
Professor Stein, can I just ask you, we've heard some mixed views about early voting, but leave that aside for a minute. What I wanted to ask you about early voting is, assume you've got it, when do you think early is too early?
I think that's a judgment on the part of elected officials. The simple fact of the matter is, in the context of this question, obviously too early wouldn't have been, probably 2 weeks would have been adequate. Had voters habituated to voting early, many of the problems I think you heard in New York and New Jersey might have been avoided. By that I say the higher proportion of vote was cast. Note, in my report, this election in 2012 in the counties affected by the hurricane was by no means unsuccessful. In spite of the hurricane, the response was pretty good. So the turnout rate dropped 2.8%, even against all the other explanations. But I would think 2 weeks is more than adequate for a couple of reasons. Candidates have to campaign.
Yep.
And let me tell you something else about early voting that you may not know about, because probably it's a little bit more partisan, but it turns out that, no pun intended, early voting states have a higher cost per vote cast when you control for all other factors. People who run campaigns are not fools. They know that if there's going to be voting taking place 2 and 3 weeks before Election Day, what are they going to do? They're going to get the GOTV out. They're going to do their mailing. They're going to do their advertising. Only they're going to do it for every day of early voting. Every day is a GOTV day. We find that news coverage goes up. That's nice. That's good for candidates and voters. But so does the cost per voting, and so does campaign fundraising. So early voting may have an advantage, not in turnout, except the types I've mentioned before, Election Day vote centers. But early voting, as you described it, in-person early voting means your campaigns now get much longer. And when they get longer, they get more expensive. And if we think that the expensive campaigns is a problem, be careful what you wish for. 2 weeks, I think, is adequate. And it's ironic. I am, as you can tell, a native not of Texas. I'm from Houston Street of New York, not Houston. But I was a little bit surprised in my own research, and I give Charles Stewart some credit for this, that the most liberal and presumably most progressive parts of this country have some of the most antiquated voting systems. It's Texas, which is hardly what I would call a state, given the recent debates that Ann and I are going to talk about as being liberal, that led the nation in in-person early voting. It's Colorado that had the first Election Day vote centers, and Oregon, and of course Washington, all mail-in balloting. So a lot of this idea of no excuse in-person or mail-in voting and in-person early voting, you got close to 40% of the vote in this country is being cast before Election Day, and among these 10 states or 24 states, that's not contributing to much of it.
And then just one other quick question. In New Jersey, you mentioned using social media, and we've heard some remark about the potential for that to be abused because it's so ubiquitous, which is the whole reason it probably works effectively. Have you seen any evidence of that means being abused by anyone trying to confuse voters?
Overall, no. I mean, we had heard some of the stories that there were things on Facebook to try and confuse voters, but in general, I think it was used in a very positive way. I think, when we're talking about social media, from our standpoint, is the way it was embedded in all the websites. When you went onto Facebook, it would pop up to say, where do you vote today? And you could go right to the tool and find out where to vote. We try to work with like Rock the Vote and organizations like that to make sure that they're getting the right message out. So I think in general, the more mainstream social media is a very positive effect on elections.
Commissioner Britton?
So I'm impressed with how you all handle these these disasters and issues. There's the pre-planning, but then there's also the aftermath. And my assumption is that the number of provisional votes went up substantially. Is that correct? So how did you handle that? Did you have to do anything different or anything significant? And was there any concern about the number of provisional votes you had?
I mean, it definitely went up. One of the things we obviously had to do differently, our normal provisional ballot law allows you to vote anywhere within your county if you move or your information is not correct. By expanding out to the entire state, the process was if you voted in Bergen County but you lived in Ocean County, Bergen County would have to get that ballot back to Ocean County. So there was definitely a different process that you normally would not see, and the counties had to communicate amongst each other to get the ballots back to where they belonged so they were counted in the proper counties, and those voters got credit for voting.
The design of our election system is very narrowly focused to the voter is only eligible to vote for certain offices because the ballot contains, it's top to bottom. It was a federal election, so it had the top offices, but then it had a lot of local offices that if you're not eligible to vote for, the ballot's just not available. So, expanding the provisional balloting became a bit problematic because, the voter simply isn't eligible to vote for some of the offices that are on that ballot. So, and then after the election, as Bob pointed out, getting the ballot to the right person to record the history that voter voted properly, became a logistical issue that, quite honestly has strung out some of the results from our elections and through to this year, because ballots were moved. A lot of ballots were moved around, so that's something that going forward is something we'd have to look to as to the logistics of when that occurs. If you allow some of that thing by an emergency decree, we didn't lose any ballots. It's not like we lost ballots, but it's just we weren't ready to move so many because usually they come back to one secure location. Now you have to bring it back to a secure location, then move it to another location. So working on that logistics in the future is something we're going to have to deal with.
It's interesting. In disaster counties, provisional ballots cast as a proportion of all ballots went up significantly, but no change in the number of provisional ballots that were counted. So, and if you know how provisional ballots have to be counted, and I'm sure it might have changed in New Jersey and New York, you, the voter, have to come back and validate your ID or your location. Maybe what happened, and I don't know, that's what the question is, you might have given out more provisional ballots, but you didn't count any more of those provisional ballots. I suspect maybe the voters, because of the dislocation of the hurricane, were not able to get back to offer whatever information they needed. Or they may have been counted without that voter having to come back and validate their identification in precinct location. But it ran 51% on average in those 225 counties, but you saw an increase of about 0.006 to 0.08 number of ballots counted, cast. So something was happening there, and that's what would have been interesting to know.
Well, thank you very much to this panel. Outstanding, and we much appreciate it. We're going to, because of the significant amount of testimony we still have to hear for the rest of the day, we're going to move directly to the next panel with John Carbone of IACRIOT and Steve Graves at MIT. That's a 45-minute panel. We'll recess at 11:45 for lunch, which, with the expectation that we'll be back in 20 minutes thereafter and start early with the panels, the post-lunch panels. So if we could have Mr. Carbone and Mr. Graves join us here, please. Good morning. I didn't realize you were, yes, you're the president. Hello.
Well, I'm immediate past president now, Mr.
Immediate past
Co-Chair. My name is Joanne Rajapi, and I'm immediate past chair of IACRIOT, the International Association of Clerks, Recorders, Election Officials, and Treasurers. It is the largest organization of election officials in the country. And as you know, the Commission made an appearance at our annual conference in Louisville in July, and from that, I decided to form a task force of our election officials in IACRIOT. Mr. John Carbone was the chair of that task force. Our members, because they're election officials, are in the trenches. They are the people that actually perform the elections, and of course are very knowledgeable. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. John Carbone to produce and report, give a synopsis of the report we have from our election officials. And thank you very much for the opportunity today.
Thank you. And I also want to note, Mr. Carbone, obviously you've submitted in writing your testimony. So what we'll do is hope that you can summarize in the 8 minutes you have and leave time for the Commission on this schedule to ask questions.
I would intend that. You have the report in the 15 pages in the summary. There's an additional report was submitted to the committee which contains approximately 60 pages, which has a number of appendices. The appendices deal with a number of specific issues that identified election officials have asked us to address. There's a section on the hurricane in New Jersey. There's a section dealing with the Cook County Board of Elections, who talked about lines, dealing with lines, anticipating lines. There's a section from the Chicago Board of Elections, which deals on vote centers. In particular, they have come up with a very interesting idea of what they call super vote centers. They're doing it at convention centers, sporting venues, etc. Opening it early, that provides parking, very good visibility, access, and the ability of candidates to campaign outside the parameters of the center itself. There's a report from Mr. Balak from El Paso County, Colorado Springs, which deals with a comparison of direct read votes by tabulation as compared to hand counts, finding that hand counts, surprisingly, are not accurate. The machine in general produces a greater level of accuracy. And there's also one from Noah Prats, who has given us what he calls the perfect election district map and how to deal with it. What I do want to deal with is the concern that IACRIOT and its officials have. We welcome the Commission. We welcome the President's invitation. We look forward to a report. But we're concerned. We're concerned about a number of things. Many reports are written. Many reports get bound in leather with gold stamped, go up on the shelf, and are never seen again. We want to ensure that you follow the 4 Ps in developing your report, that you ensure what you offer is practical, that it is possible, that it is politically palatable, and purchasable. In addition, we're hoping that many of the recommendations you make and many of the best practices we have suggested are somewhat scaled or identified. Some of these are long-term, some of these are interesting and never, some of these are technology-driven, which technology will be out of date next year. Many of them are advocates from positions of what they're looking to do. Our view is we are not academics. We don't look at the why of elections. We look at the how of elections. And looking at the how of elections, we've come up with a number of recommendations in the report, a number of suggestions. Again, one that appears to be easily implemented without legislation is election boards, county election boards, and we have one that's tried it as a test in the last election, tweeting to voters waiting times at polling places. Voters could sign up before the election to receive these tweets. Campaigns, candidates, political parties, advocacy groups, unions could also sign up. So they would know at the physical polling places, which are not super centers, what the wait time may or may not be. Tweets may last, tweets may go away, God knows what the next innovation would be, but it's a way of interaction that one election official has done that we're intending to hopefully replicate with it through our membership, but it doesn't require legislation. And that's one of the other concerns we have. In all your recommendations, the practical, the possible, the political, the purchasable. We hope we are not binding it to legislation. The potential for legislation being adopted on a uniform basis nationwide, the potential for adoption or recommendations of legislation that would be uniform and complete by every state legislature is very doubtful. So a lot of what we're recommending and what we're looking for is you to consider things that we can do that either require no legislation, perhaps mere regulatory change, or are palatable, suggesting again the tweeting, are palatable, practical, and political without major legislative change, a pile-on of interest groups, of vendors, of political interests, and that would raise a concern with us. The other thing that we're concerned about is, and I think I know the two co-chairmen have done what I have done. I've done Governor Kane's recount, Governor Thompson's recount in Illinois. We've all been there in the trenches in the field. And we've all come to realize that an election is not a singular event in one day, it's a process. And facing the election as a process, if you look at it in the gestalt or step back at a larger pattern, you realize that a lot of what gets done under bipartisan control at the state level. Not by elected officials who are bureaucrats, not by civil servants, but there is a bipartisan control. Now, if I was a third party, a minority party, a small party, I'd be concerned by that. It's not provided for in the Constitution, it's not in the law. But most election boards, most election functioning, whether it be challengers at the polling place or anywhere else, is a bipartisan effort. It's not bad. There's nothing wrong with it. It provides actors, it provides balance, and it provides a way of ensuring the adoption and use of anything you recommend. So again, we would hope that you would continue to look at it as a bipartisan venture. The commission is that, the political parties is that, and I think that's an important consideration. Beyond that, I'm available for questions.
Thank you very much. Professor Graves.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and yeah, I have some slides. Thank you for inviting me to present to the Commission. I'm pleased to be here to discuss methods and tools for allocating resources to improve voting. Just as background, I'm a professor in the operations area at the MIT Sloan School, having joined the faculty 36 years ago. I'm a faculty affiliate of the MIT Operations Research Center. I have joint appointments in the Engineering Systems Division and the Mechanical Engineering Department. I'm also a faculty affiliate of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project. I do industry-based research. I'm not an expert on voting. I work on collaborative projects to optimize and improve industrial supply chains and manufacturing systems. We've worked with dozens of companies ranging from Amazon to Intel, Boeing to General Motors, Samsung, Staples, so forth. Okay, let me just put this down. So long lines and waiting occur when there are inadequate resources. At a voting site, resources could include voting machines, voting booths, poll workers. These resources are inevitably constrained. Election officials must decide how many resources are needed and then determine how best to allocate these resources. Tools exist to help managers to understand the trade-offs and to make these decisions. In particular, we are interested in deploying tools that can address a range of questions. Given a number of machines or a number of people, how should they be allocated across the number of sites? Or if we're given a service target, then we might want to know how many resources are needed to achieve the target and how to allocate those. For instance, how do we assure that only a small fraction of voters wait more than 5 minutes? Finally, we might want to have the capability to address various what-if questions. What if the time to vote is longer than we expect or shorter? What if more voters turn out for the election? So the type of tool we envision is based on queuing theory, the study of waiting lines. This figure shows a simple system. Customers arrive, they queue up, they get served, they leave the system. We can view a voting site as a series of queues. Again, here we just show that voters arrive, they wait to register or check in, they wait again to vote, they may wait a third time to submit their ballots, and eventually to leave the system, depending upon the voting technology. So we've developed a very simple prototype of a resource planning and allocation tool. The tool uses the simplest queuing models, ones that would be commonly found in an operations textbook. The current version of the tool acts as a calculator that would allow an election official to experiment with different resource allocations and to find optimal or near optimal solutions. The tool provides a rough cut analysis and could be complemented by having a simulation tool that could be used for both validation and more detailed planning. Finally, we note that the application of queuing theory is very, very common in resource planning for many service contexts, including call centers, healthcare delivery systems, public emergency response systems, and even theme parks. So here I just provide a screenshot, not for you to read, but just to show you what the spreadsheet might look like. The tool characterizes the waiting time to vote for election sites, in this case that use machines to vote. The inputs are in yellow and would include estimates of the arrival rate of voters, estimates of the time to vote, as well as the number of machines that were allocated to each voting site. In the orange cells are policy parameters specifying the service targets, and in the pink cells are the calculated outputs reporting the system performance. I'll illustrate all of this with a simple, hypothetical, small example. So as my example, suppose we have 3 precincts, we have 15 machines to allocate. Let's suppose the average time to vote is 6 minutes. The service target might be that we want to minimize the fraction of voters that have to wait more than 3 minutes. And we look at the peak period. And we might assume that we've got some estimate of what the voter turnout is during that peak period. And in this case, it's 20 voters per hour for Precinct 1, 35 for 2, and 45 for Precinct 3. So the tool will allow us to examine various allocations. A naive allocation might give each precinct the same number, namely 5 machines. The tool would report the average wait time for a voter, as well as the fraction of voters that experience waits longer than the target of 3 minutes. We see here that the wait times are dramatically different. They seem reasonable at Precinct 1, but excessive at Precinct 3. 9 minutes on average, with a majority experiencing waits in excess of the service target of 3 minutes. Indeed, in this case, many, many voters in Precinct 3 will have much longer waits. A natural question is, can we do better? And so here, we might take one machine away from Precinct 1 and allocate it to Precinct 3. That's an obvious thing to do. This helps a lot. Now the wait times are more comparable across the precincts. Should we do it again? What if we move another machine from Precinct 1 to 3? We see here that we've gone too far. With only 3 machines at Precinct 1, in the second example, the wait times again become excessive. So it seems here the best allocation of 15 machines in this simple example would be 4 to Precinct 1, 5 to Precinct 2, 6 to Precinct 3. But we might look at these wait times and say, well, they're too long. So what if we had more resources? What would we do? And so the tool could also tell us what's the value from incremental resources. And here we just show that if we added one more machine just to one of the precincts, to each of the precincts, what would be the reduction in the average wait time? So for instance, at Precinct 1, we would reduce the average wait time by 58 seconds. So we might look at this and we might say, well, gee, the best thing to do would be to put that extra machine at Precinct 3, in which case we, again, can check the overall performance and see there that it's quite good at Precinct 3. We might also ask how many machines are needed to achieve some service target. For instance, suppose that we want no more than 10% of the voters in each precinct to have to wait more than 3 minutes. Then how many machines are needed? The tool could determine that. In this case, we'd need 18 machines allocated as shown. We can check the performance and see indeed the performance is quite good. The wait time at every precinct is on the order of a half minute, and about 5% of the voters would have to wait longer than 3 minutes, 95% less. The tool could also be very useful for examining various what-if questions. The example here is to suppose that we could somehow improve the process and reduce the time to vote on average from 6 minutes to 5.4 minutes, a reduction of 10%. This might be the result of a redesign of the ballot or an improvement of the user interface or providing advanced information on the election choices to the voters. The tool can help the election official to see the impact. In this case, with 15 machines, we see a dramatic improvement in which we are now able to meet our service target. Namely, in each precinct, no more than 10% of the voters experience a wait of 3 or more minutes. This insight can be very, very helpful in figuring out where to focus improvement efforts and to identifying the points of most leverage for improving the system. So I just go quickly here. We have a similar tool that we've built for check-in. The tool I've shown you is for the voting stage, and we might, an example of the check-in time, we're at half a minute. How many stations would we need so that there's minimal waiting at check-in? And we see here we need 1 station for precinct 1 and 2 for precinct 2 and 3. The analysis here can also account for what often happens in check-in where you have multiple lines. Say you split up the voters by the alphabet. The queuing dynamics are quite a bit different, and we can compare setups with a single line or a multiple line. In summary, in any service system we have waiting when resources are inadequate. This can occur due to poor allocation of existing resources, as well as due to not having enough resources to start with. Tools based on queuing theory are commonly used to determine the waiting times in these systems, as well as to provide guidance on how many resources are needed and how best to allocate them. These tools are applicable to voting operations and could help election officials with their resource planning. The applications of these tools requires estimates of the voter turnout and estimates of the time to vote or check in. The applications also requires some judgments on service targets as to what amount of waiting is acceptable. Finally, the deployment of these tools should go hand in hand with the training of election officials on how best to use them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Graves. So we'll turn to commission questions. Any questions? I have a question. Should I lead the question? Commissioner Ginsburg, do you have a question?
No, go right ahead, Mr. Bauer.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. Mr. Carbone, a question for you and then one for Mr. Graves. The question I have for you is you referred to the 4 Ps and one of your Ps is purchasable. Do you want to comment a little bit about resource constraints here? Because I assume that's what you're referring to. And as you know, that's an issue that we can only address in so many ways within the mandate of this commission, but at the same time, we're mindful we hear a good bit about it, and you touched upon it. Do you want to expand for a second about sort of within your community, just exactly how that's being experienced and addressed?
Most election offices are at the bottom of the political feeding chain for funding. Most elected officials who fund political operations think it only functions 2 days a year, primary day and general election day. They have little understanding or little concern. It's not a squeaky wheel. It's not an advocacy group. It's not a group of citizens who want money, so it doesn't flow there. The only funding we have ever had nationally has been the HAVA, Help America Vote Act, which was a significant amount of funding, but was used in many different ways in many different states and sometimes didn't get to the elected officials. Our concern is you can make some of the greatest recommendations, which I'm sure you will, but if they're not funded, either federally, at the state level or the county level, they're difficult, if not implementable at all. That's why we are looking for recommendations that are purchasable. There is not going to be a poll tax. There is not going to be a surcharge on something to fund elections. Since it is the consent of the governed we're seeking, it is the most important act a citizen can perform. It should be the most receptive act the government wants. You would think that there would be funding for it. And unfortunately, it just isn't there.
And the reason you say is just it's simply a question of priorities, that whatever arguments you make are outweighed by arguments made for other alternative resource uses.
It's not only priorities, but the reflection you get is, well, gee, you just bought those computers 6 years ago for elections. Why do you need new ones? Didn't you just buy that system? What's happened now? No one takes into effect that there are registration issues for people moving, the cost of changing those registrations, updating registration rolls. No one takes into effect that the early voting, the mail voting, staffing polling places which have in the early voting centers, workers, people present who may only service 15, 20 people a day. They're there, but they're not getting the full crunch that you get on election day. So there are costs involved with the ease of access, but everyone still reflects upon it as being a polling-driven process. I mean, even in the statistical studies, it's difficult to compare election district to election district, county to county, when you start saying, well, how many votes were cast and how much did you spend at the polls? Well, how many of them were not cast at the polls is an important consideration, because the ones not cast at the polls probably cost the most, but also made ease of access or early voting possible. And let me just even deal with the electronic voting books. If the Apple Corporation wanted to give iPads to every election district in the country and we gave them a huge tax write-off, it would change elections. We've talked about these electronic poll books. You wouldn't have lines. Any line you go to, you could register to vote. And you wouldn't have to vote at your own polling place. You could vote at any polling place, meaning vote anywhere. You show up, you sign in, you vote, and electronically that vote is not recorded in the polling book, but the polling book no longer accesses or allows Bob Bauer to vote elsewhere. Likewise, if there is a line, somebody can go down the line and say, did you change? Did you get married? Has there been any change in your address? You can update election information and registrations there. So that would make the ability to vote anywhere. That would ease the lines. That would take it away. And think of what the cost of an iPad is, and obviously some software to develop. And you could have a system which interrelates within your county, within your state, and if you wanted to, you could have a registration system which is a national registration system. I moved from California to New York, and my registration could change. Likewise, if I do move to New York and I vote in New York, California will be alerted that I should no longer be voting there. Not a big expense. Massive expense, one-time expense, perhaps, but that's the kind of expense you would look at. But to get everybody to sign on to that, I don't know who convinces them.
Thank you. Professor Graves, just on your last point in your summary about the importance of deploying with the tools, tutorials, and capabilities for detailed simulations, this is the question I'm going to ask you is a broad one, but one of the issues, as you know, that we've been talking about is how to think about translating what's available into the world in which we have local election officials who have to be making the judgments you talked about, have to be thinking about how to work with this material and be trained to work with this kind of material with these sorts of tools effectively. Is there are there guidelines or sort of points of first consideration that we should have in mind as we sort of think about how we would take this kind of tool and then make it essentially sort of user-friendly, teach the use in a way that gives it some uniform effectiveness?
Well, I'll give you a couple of reactions. I mean, my hope would be to get some feedback from election officials, with tools like this as to, are they appropriate? What would make them better? Do they help them with doing their jobs? Mm-hmm. And then based on that feedback, refine it. But then also, as I say, I think, there is a need for an educational campaign. And I would try to keep things simple and get us to walk before we run, and also do it in light of the type of data that exists. And any type of tool model like this needs inputs, and you don't want to make things more sophisticated than the quality of the data or the estimates that you would put into it.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Ginsburg?
Professor Graves, could I follow up on that? We may do a little role-playing here with Mr. Carbone since he's a local election official, but you have this tool that looks very promising for dealing with lines. How do you actually take this tool that you described and make it available to a local election official, run through the tutorials specifically that local election official would need? In other words, how do we do this on a practical basis? What form does it come into a local election official? And then I'd like Mr. Carbone to react to the sort of practicality, possibility, political implementation of it.
Well, again, I think the tool, it would just be an open source tool, something that would get posted someplace that could be downloaded. It would be nice to have examples that are built around it that should show people how to use it. I think it has to be augmented with material to help people figure out what are the appropriate inputs that go into the tool. I could also imagine that there would be sort of a series of tutorials that might be online tutorials or just might be a educational campaign that goes out. I'm not sure if I'm addressing your question.
No, you are. So it would be open sourced. You would pull down the formula into a local election official's computer. You would then input the information based presumably on the last election or the last couple of elections, and see what you came up with.
I think it would be nice to have illustrative cases that somebody could look at to see how it was used. But I think it's also very critical, and I haven't really dealt with this, but how do you look back at the history and try to make those projections for the next year to come?
So if you had the data inputs that you talked about and just illustrated for us from past elections, where we ought to have most of them anyways, that would be the sort of trial runs that a local jurisdiction would go through?
Yes, although you want to account for, what's changed since the last election? Is there a different number of registered voters, or is it a different type of election? And then how do you make adjustments as you anticipate this next election?
And the ballot is the same in all the various variables. Any thoughts, Mr. Carbone, on how something like this?
Yes, Co-Chairman Ginsburg. Mr. Pratt of Cook County addresses a system they already use in attempting to define what the lines will be. But the problem in any system like this is planning is not the projection of the present into the future. As Steve did say, things change. Candidates change. The effectiveness of a campaign may change. The hotness of a campaign. You have polling places relocated from a school to a church, from a church to another building. And that could affect the lines. The access into the building could change the lines. Burying the polling place deeper into the school. There's a whole series of factors that you really can't anticipate to compare election to election. Do you have certain constraints? Well, you have constraints. The number of registered voters assigned to that district is a potential pool of voters. If you could weed some out into an early voting system, you could weed some out into a non-excuse vote by mail, vote absentee ballot. You remove that surge, perhaps. But then you also have the issues that some people vote when they go to work, some people vote when they come home, some people vote when they go to pick up their children at school. And you're going to have, you can't have it all spread out evenly over the day. You're going to have those surges. One of the things that we have recommended to all the officials is the Walmart greeter. Having somebody readily identifying the polling place. It's sometimes hard to find a polling place. We have a universal sign for beware of moose if you go up to Vermont and Maine. But do you think we have a universal sign like a stop sign that says polling place here? It is difficult to figure out sometimes where the polling place is. Then you get in the labyrinth of a school somewhere in the basement. Greeters, they're out front. Not campaign workers, not candidates, greeters who bring you in, directing you, welcome you. And the use of the greeter speeds the person in and out of the polling place. Steve has also presented what this could do. I don't think that You know, I have a 90-year-old mother who teaches me to use my iPad. She's unique. Many of these election workers and poll workers may not be able to handle that level of sophistication in the study. But I'm going to also tell you, there are poll workers who don't need to be told they're going to have lines. They know there's a hot campaign in their district, in their city. They can see when lines are backing up, and they need to take affirmative steps, and most of them do, to speeding them through the polling place. Some of the things that have been mentioned is, you know, don't ask me why all polling books are A to L and M to Z. Break them up into 4 or 5. You can have a poll worker handling 2 books, and if we had the electronic poll books, you're not going to have backups in lines.
Mr. Carbone, are you saying if he gave you the formula, you wouldn't use it?
It's not a question of I wouldn't use it. I'm an attorney. The question is, would somebody need to use it? If we have a district in the Midwest in a very small populated county, you're not going to have lines. In those areas in which you have lines, and let's take Cook County, Illinois, Noah Pratt's already has a formula in a system where and that's in the appendix, where he tries to utilize that. So there are some of the larger districts that are considering that. Now, is there technological reluctance, academic reluctance? Perhaps. Could you order someone to use it? No. And then the problem you're going to get, and I'm not suggesting everyone would answer this way, is, okay, I know I'm going to have a line. What can I do about it? Well, the what can I do about it is the part that we like to address on how to do it. But the historically figuring out the projection of the historical into the future is a difficult thing. And if you misalign resources, that's another problem. It's not the question that they wouldn't use it. I'm not sure they all would know how to use it.
I'm not saying everyone would have to use it, but as an election official myself for the last almost 20 years, I found a remarkable, very predictable, it's very predictable on what the next election is going to be based upon the last, if you're comparing presidential to presidential, similar election to similar election. And to almost argue, as it seems to me you are, that it makes no sense to try to predict the number of people that are going to show up at a polling place. It doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't mean you're always going to hit it on the nose, but you can, I would suggest, just by going turnout in past elections, take a pretty good stab at what's going to come out, allow a little slop in there so you round off high, and then what he's doing, we did where I was, and I'm sure lots of other election officials do, so that you can go polling place by polling place, and you can allocate machines in a reasonable, sane manner, rather than your statement that in Cook County we know we're going to have lines. Well, if you know you're going to have lines, why aren't they doing something about it? It may be because they don't have the resources, and that's a legitimate reason. Then you allocate the best you can based upon the resources.
Commissioner Lomax, I mean, most of the larger districts that are going to have problems do that, either do that by a rule of thumb, standard practice, but they also try to figure it, as Mr. Pratt has done, with a standardized formula we've used with other election officials. It's not that we wouldn't use it. I'm not sure everybody could use it. And then you do get down to the problem is, okay, I've decided that this election is very contested, it's very hot, you don't have extra machines, you don't have more machines. You're going to move some resources around and you're going to move some workers around. But in effect, there still may be a delay and still may be a line in the present system and structure that we have. There are other things we could do which could eliminate lines. The vote centers, the electronic poll books. I'm not saying they wouldn't do it. I will say there might be some that wouldn't know how to do it, but they probably have their own way of figuring out what they need and where they need it. That may be a little too complex for them to do.
Okay, well, I really think it wouldn't be, but I'm not going to get into that. And I do think it's a key part of planning for an election is knowing how many voters you expect to show up and what your ability is going to be to process those voters. Because as we've listened to testimony around the country repeatedly, and I mentioned it earlier today, I mean, I hear from election officials who should have known they were going to have lines because they didn't have the capacity to process the voters. Now, I agree with you also on, greeters, there's all sorts of other things that you can do to help get people through all the way to a more accurate voter registration database. I mean, that helps speed things up too. but I do think this is a key part of it. I personally think it'd be a big help.
Mr. Commissioner Lomax, and just to give you an explanation of a statutory problem, when we used to have the old AVM and Sequoia physical machines with the little meters, they only went up to 999. After 999, you couldn't put any more votes. So most states had limitations of 500 voters in a district or 750 voters in a district or multiple machines. Now with the electronic machines, which can take any number of votes, there's little thought into how many registered voters you put into a district. And because of costs and other constraints, they sometimes load more more voters into a district than they have workers. The machine can handle it, but the physical facility, the workers can't necessarily do that. Yet, there used to be preclusions as to how many when we had machines. We don't have that anymore. Again, it's another issue to look at.
Commissioner McGeehan?
Following up a little bit on Commissioner Lomax's comments, Professor Graves, I think this is a really neat tool, and I could see how it could be used on a lot of different levels, perhaps to validate some of the statutory formulas that are out there, whether those are still appropriate, especially as the framework for voting has changed. One thing that we've wrestled with in Texas is, well, if half your population votes early, can you then reduce the number of election day polling places? I could see a tool like this could really help inform folks determine, okay, in redrawing election day precincts, how big can we make them in light of the number of folks that turn out early. So it just sounds like a very promising tool, and I look forward to examining it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess I would just emphasize that in that case with early voting, again, you need to still have a projection of what you expect on election day. And it's not just the voter turnout, but you also need to estimate how long it's going to take to vote, which can, again, vary dramatically, I think, from election to election. And those sort of two go hand in hand.
Commissioner Grayson?
I guess one other thought is since we do live in a resource-constrained world, this tool also strikes me as the kind of tool that you took it before your local jurisdiction. If to allocate more money, you can show very clearly, look, this is what you gave me. This is what we're going to get. If this isn't acceptable to you, but if I got it, just that one example you showed with the one extra machine, how much of a difference it made. This could be an effective advocacy tool as well as a management tool for administrators at the state and local level.
Yeah, at least I was trying to emphasize that, but maybe it didn't come across. But yeah, it's not just allocation, but what are the resource requirements you need if you have some service.
And this also it doesn't strike
targets.
me as very hard to come up with how many people you think are going to flow through and how long it might take to vote and what a norm ought to be. With a little bit of training, a little bit of thought. Those are, as Larry said, those are things you should know.
If I could just close, I think we don't have any additional questions here, and we're coming up against our time, but I just want to clarify one point, just generally from your testimony, Mr. Carbone, about uses of technology and some of the cautionary notes, flags you just put up about local officials and what they're able to use and whatever. You emphasized in your testimony the significance of continued technological development and its application to election administration. And so I assume that, cautionary notes aside, an organization like IACRIOT, and I'm addressing this also to a immediate past precedent here, that IACRIOT, in a world in which such tools become available and begin to circulate within the community and are tested so that we can see what the experience of local officials are, that IACRIOT would play a role in socializing that community and helping, for example, to test the experience and feed it back so that those tools become the best tools surface for use and the best trainings of local officials can be developed. Is that a fair statement of the mission of your organization and how you would relate to the development of this technology?
Initially, or previously, the Election Assistance Commission evaluated and approved voting machines. So you would get a list of approved and accepted systems. And that's kind of halting a little. The market doesn't have a lot of vendors. And of course, the vendors that are there sound like late-night TV schlock salesmen as to what their systems can do. But one of the things we do is we share experiences, recommendations, voting systems. And it's not just the purchase and the technological obsolescence, but it's the support. At the present time, the largest manufacturer of voting machines went out of business. There is no support, and that's become an issue. So again, we need the the Election Assistance Commission looking at voting systems, but we need vendors to step forward with compatible projects which are open source, easily technologically improved, or not locked into proprietary software. We have at our conventions vendors that we've vetted that give the support and have come with high recommendations, but there is nobody out there offering a system. The last system you had was by a company that was owned by Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and that caused all kinds of security concerns, as you well know and as Ben well knows. So we need some kind of market, something in the market to come forward that we can look at that meets those standards and recommendations. But we do recommend, we do validate, we do disparage.
Right, and that would include, and just to be clear, and so that would include not just the big ticket items like voting equipment technology, but even just tools like the ones we're discussing now. And Commission will be looking at other tools like that, like the one that Professor Graves has described, that help election officials,
Yeah, IACRIOT
map out efficient ways of conducting their elections. Pardon me?
IACRIOT is definitely a vehicle to get that information out, to educate our members. We share our experiences, especially in elections.
Okay.
And if I might just say one thing about queuing, the time to vote varies dramatically because you have people that don't have, their signature does not match. There are people that are on the rolls and are asterisked because they need ID. There are people who see a voting machine and do not know how to vote. There are people who need assistance in a voting machine and have to sign a waiver to allow that person to go into them. So when we say it takes so much time to vote, that is a very movable time frame. And I'm not talking about one or two exceptions because I'm there, I do it. I also do vote by mail. And I have to tell you, I would say 1 out of 8, 1 out of 9 have an issue that takes a longer amount of time to resolve.
Just clarify.
please,
Yeah,
Professor.
so the model just assumes there's an average time to vote,
I'm
not,
sure
not
yes,
that everybody.
I understand.
So that average, yeah, that's it. And
I
accounting
understand.
for the fact that
It
there are
accounts for
tails.
that, yes.
Yeah.
In New Jersey, we limit your time in the polling place to 2 minutes. Just to avoid backlog in the machine, not in the polling place, I'm sorry, in the machine. And I have actually been present in an election polling district in Hudson County where the worker physically went in and yanked the voter out.
On that note, I think, we'll recess for 20 minutes. I think the goal would be to be back here by 12:10, please. Thank you.